Hello, this is Adrian Gonzalez, president of Adelante, and I am pleased to welcome you today to today's Mind Pick session, where Adelante members can pick the brains of leading academics, thought leaders, business executives, and other folks in the supply chain and leadership development realm. Our guest today is Tim Stratman, who is founder and president of Stratman Partners Executive Coaching, an executive search firm based out in the Chicago area. And Tim helps C-level executives become more effective leaders. Tim has worked with a variety of different executives across many different industries. And prior to that, Tim spent more than 20 years at RR Donnelley in a variety of different leadership positions, including president of RR Donnelley Direct and as a senior VP of supply chain management. So, Tim, thank you for joining us.
Well, Adrian, thank you. Really glad to be here. Appreciate you asking me to join the Mind Pick session. Hope I've got enough of a mind that it can be picked at today. Just a small correction. I'm not a search guy. I'm pure coaching. So I just want to make sure that people know that what we do, we really don't get involved in executive recruiting at all. What we're involved in primarily is one-on-one coaching of individuals and teams, and we have a subspecialty in the supply chain area too. Just want to make sure. Sometimes people kind of make that mistake where they think that they're one and the same, and they're really very different.
Great. Well, thanks for the clarification. And before we get started, I just want to remind members that are joining us today that you can ask questions at any time via the chat session on the left-hand side of the screen. Just type your questions. I'll keep an eye on it, see if any questions come up, and I'll weave them into the conversation. Tim, before we kind of dive into the topic of supply chain leadership and leadership development, why don't you give us a kind of a quick synopsis of your career path, how you got involved with supply chain management, and then ultimately how and why you got involved in executive coaching.
Well, I would say that much like a lot of people's careers, I mean, I started in a very line kind of role. I mean, I was a sales rep when I first started way back when, in the 80s, but as I progressed through the company I was in, I was able to develop management competencies that allowed me to manage other people and to work through other people, which is really one of the key leadership competencies that we talk about. But I kind of played in every part of the organization. I had a stint in operations. I had a stint in sales and marketing. I was involved in global marketing and sales, as well as you pointed out, supply chain management. And that was one of the kind of the premier roles in my career as I look at it. I mean, from that, I became a general manager, but I probably didn't get a better preparation for running a business than I got when I was running supply chain. And so, much like a lot of companies, getting that exposure to a diverse set of functions and business situations was a kind of a critical part of my career path. And I would say how I got into coaching is when I was running organizations and businesses, I think there's nothing more satisfying to me than developing people and working through people to get things done. And maybe it was male menopause or something, but I hit the mid-40s and decided, hey, I don't really want to spend the rest of my career doing all this other stuff that I had to do in my life. I wanted to really focus in on coaching and developing people. And I had also had the benefit of having my own coach for 5 years. And in that time, had some significant success. So I knew the connection between coaching and performance and achievement, and really wanted to kind of, I guess, hang up a shingle and start my own business. So I was 2 doors down here in Chicago off Wacker Drive. I started my firm. So that's kind of why I got into it. Probably the key reason I'm a coach is because this is what I want to spend my life doing. I feel
Great. Great. Well, that's fantastic. It's funny because I'm in my early 40s, and as you know, Adelante kind of has, as part of our mission, is involved with leadership development and peer-to-peer learning. So I think I got the same bug you got at your same stage in your career, where I want to kind of focus my time and effort on this. Well, great background. Thank you for the synopsis there. Let me start by asking you a question that we asked attendees to last month's Adelante breakout meeting where we had, a half-day session on leadership development. And the question was this: if you're the CEO of a company and you're looking to hire or promote a chief supply chain officer, what skills, knowledge, experience would you look for in a candidate's resume, and why?
Great question. My first answer would be, to be the chief supply chain officer, you have to have general management skills. I was on a call earlier today with another group, and we were talking about how the company that this individual was in was really focused on growth and focused on product development, product introduction, and felt supply chain was an integral part of that. And because of that, they're really emphasizing general management skills that allow the specialist, if you will, in supply chain to broaden that skill set by involving them in marketing and selling, not actually doing the selling, but exposure to those functional areas and commercialization areas. So I'd be looking for somebody who had a diverse set of experiences to run the organization, and I'd probably be testing that individual in the process to see what their general management acumen is. How well do they develop teams? How well do they manage people? How well do they think strategically and around the corners, if you will? These are the things that I think are becoming more and more essential because, ironically, no function in the company has a broader perspective than supply chain. I mean, you actually have a conceptual framework that covers the buy side all the way through the sell side of a company. So when you combine that experience with a general management skill set, I think you've got a senior officer that can really take a business somewhere. Obviously, the skill of supply chain and knowledge, native knowledge in supply chain management is important. But as I tell clients that are looking to get a CEO job, when you get to a certain level, certain things are givens. And it's kind of a given at that level that you have a command of the discipline, at least a solid command of the discipline, if not a very good command of it. The question then becomes, what's going to differentiate one candidate from another? And it's usually how effectively they can lead. Proxy for that is general management skill sets and experience.
One of the things that I hear a lot from executives is, a lot of folks kind of land into supply chain management, right? So they might have, their background might be in engineering. I mean, I know a lot of engineers that start out in manufacturing, for example, then ultimately end up in supply chain. And when I ask executives, what's kind of missing out of your background and your skill set, for a lot of them, it's the financial, the finance background, right? So they never took kind of a finance course. And they say, it's the ability to kind of speak the language of the CFO, the CEO, being able to put kind of, relate kind of these supply chain metrics into, a larger business perspective or a financial perspective. Do you see that as well? And, how does one go about kind of getting that experience? I mean, obviously one thing is to kind of take a course in finance and get the foundation there. Any advice, any thoughts? Do you see that kind of being a skill gap for many kind of manager level kind of executives in this area?
Yeah, actually I do. Often because supply chain, the discipline is very technically focused, process focused. The running a P&L, understanding a P&L and a balance sheet, and how they interact at the corporate level and how they're driven through functions, those are critical skill sets. I think, though, that one of the things that successful supply chain managers, directors, people that really want to climb in the discipline do, is they find people within the company that they can learn from. Many supply chain organizations have a matrix, finance person supporting their function. Some actually have a fully dedicated finance person within the function. Getting time with that person and just saying, hey, I want to spend a couple hours with you if you can afford it, even after work. I just want to get a better understanding of how the finances roll up and what your day-to-day job looks like and what you think I should know in this job. Those are probably the most powerful interactions. There are people within your company right now that would be thrilled especially in the finance area where they're often shunned, that would be thrilled to sit down and talk to somebody, in supply chain about finance. The other thing that's ironic is that finance is very consistent with the technical competencies of supply chain managers. If you can go through it, my father's 90, he said, if you can get through engineering school, you could probably figure out finance. Of course, he's an engineer, but I think that's true. I think the orientation, the numerical and quantitative orientation of finance and engineering are pretty consistent and congruent. So I suggest that you get involved with real, not financial theory, but real stuff. How does how does supply chain savings get counted? How does that happen? How do you translate an operational metric into a financial metric? Understand what a balance sheet does. We've all taken the courses in college, but it's theoretical until you're actually running a business. So the ability to connect with people in your company that will share those perspectives with you, I think, is really important.
Yeah, that's great advice. I mean, I have a background in engineering and always thought of myself as having good numbers and analytical skills. And when I launched my own company and I do my own books right now, so I'm managing my own P&L and balance sheet. It is important to have someone that you can go to, because it isn't as intuitive as you would think it is. It's very different than managing your own personal finances at home. I mean, there's a lot of when it comes to running a business, a P&L, balance sheet, and things like that. I think your advice is great. Is really have someone there on your side that you can learn from. And obviously, in the context that's the most valuable, you can take a course. But if it's within the context of your business in the day to day, I think that's the obvious, the most practical way to move up the learning curve there. Supply chain very very dynamic. Things are constantly changing in the industry. I imagine that a lot of the challenges, a lot of the the nature of the conversations that you had with executives, a few years ago are arguably different than they are today. Are they different? Are there things that executives are wrestling with today that's different than a few years ago? And if so, what are some of those kind of newer things that have emerged on the on the front burner for some of these executives?
Well, I've already alluded to one of them, but no question, and I think for most supply chain folks, they would say this, that when the downturn hit, supply chain saved a lot of bottom lines in companies. If it wasn't for supply chain, a lot of companies would not have shown a profit. The problem, of course, with the challenges with most businesses right now in America, I would say, and I'm generalizing, but it's all about growth. We've gone through a cycle where we've become extremely efficient at cost management. It's become a science. It's never over. But the problem that a lot of companies are having is their boards are asking them, where are you going to grow? When am I going to start to see the revenue line go up again? And again, I'm fortunate to have talked with somebody today who's running a major supply chain organization. He said, what's changed in our company, and I've got my CEO to agree with this, that growth trumps cost, which was an amazing statement. Not that we don't have to be incredibly maniacal about cost management, but that we have got to play in the growth side. And I think that is happening more and more with supply chain management. How are you going to contribute in supply chain to top-line revenue growth? And it has a different orientation to it than cost out, right? I mean, it involves often cross-functional teams where you're working with marketing, you're working with product development, research and development. So I'm seeing a much bigger move now to get supply chain into the growth story of a company, which means, frankly, that supply chain practitioners have to begin to adopt some of those mindsets that are kind of intrinsic to growth-oriented executives. One being, as I tell people, our job is to prevent the downside from happening, but to enable the upside. And that thought process is unusual for some supply chain people who are constantly trying to make sure bad things don't happen, that products get delivered, that inventory is available, and all of those things. But the growth demands that companies are experiencing are actually asking for a mindset that says, how can I help? How can my function help get product synergy, get market share growing in certain segments of our business? And I'm starting to see that is a major move. The other one, of course, I would say is risk management, which is how do you manage supply chain risk, which continues to be a pretty significant problem or challenge for companies, and it's just beginning to emerge now as a major issue.
Yeah, those are two great points. I mean, I think in some of the writings that you've done in this area, you talked about getting to know your customer, and I know you related to the point you just made. Having whenever I talk to a lot of executives that they're traveling, they tend to be visiting suppliers, right, or their 3PL partners, or they're over in Asia with the contract manufacturers. Rarely do I hear, "Oh, I'm going to be gone in the next 2 weeks visiting customers." So it sounds like, kind of at the front end of, executives and companies that are kind of more forward-thinking or ahead of the curve are those that are kind of, really involving supply chain, at the customer end of things.
Absolutely, and I think that supply chain still is not well understood by other functional areas and companies. That's a generalization. That clearly there are companies that really have integrated supply chain and understand it well, but still remains somewhat of a mystery to a lot of functional areas. But I think when, as practitioners, we can help them solve that mystery by being pretty overt about the value that we drive and the help that we can provide. And I think in doing that, you can get a seat at the table with customers. But people have to understand what supply chain is and how supply chain can impact positive customer relationships. And I still think that there's work to be done there. So you kind of have to do both. You have to educate the folks on the sales and marketing side and sometimes in general management as to what supply chain really can do in the growth story.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, I remember at a conference a couple of years ago that we had, I was talking to one of the executives, supply chain executives. I think he's director level, but he was talking about where he saw his next, the next opportunity for his team was really, he viewed the capabilities they were able to build on the supply chain side as a competitive differentiator, and wanted to work with sales to help position their ability to deliver products faster or on a more flexible schedule or at a lower cost, whatever, those areas, to position that as a sales story, capability, to say, here's why you should work with us, or you should buy more from us, because we're able to be more flexible, faster, cheaper, be more responsive to your needs versus the competition, to really position supply chain as a competitive weapon. That was really the first time that I heard someone really talking, about that. So I'm glad to kind of hear that others are beginning to think that way as well. Shifting gears a little bit, there's been a lot of buzz lately around this article that was published in The Atlantic, I think it was last month, titled "Why Women Still Can't Have It All," and really touches upon a topic that affects both male and female, executives, albeit differently for males and females. But it says, work-life, balance. Is this an area that, you're hearing from executives in terms of that, it's a challenge for them? And, what kind of advice do you give to, executives in terms of finding the right balance, the right work-life balance, not only for themselves, but for a lot of their team members as well?
Well, there's no question it's a big issue. And I think, again, the last 3 years or 4 years have been pretty tough years. So a lot of people have been working a lot of long hours to offset the economic impact of the downturn and some of the challenges that we've had in the economy. So certainly, I don't talk to many people who say they don't have enough to do, that they're bored. And there's plenty to do. The question is, how do you see yourself as a leader? And I call it the Omnipotent Complex. Believe it or not, the way work-life balance starts, in my view, especially with the clients I work with, is to confront your own sense of omnipotence. I think all of us would like to believe that we can do everything. We've been trained since we were children to do more, to achieve more. Reality of it is, though, any rational human being will say, I'm not omnipotent. I do have not a theoretical limit, but an actual limit to the amount of things I can do, the amount of energy I can spend. So if you can get that into your head, you're on your way, in my opinion, to work-life balance. There are people who have a hard time with that because they actually have convinced themselves that they have an unlimited resource called time and energy, which, they have to confront the beast, if you will, because that's just not the case. The next thing I would say after that is that we have to look at priorities. And priorities are not static. We have to continually, on almost a weekly basis, I think, as executives, see if our priorities are in line. How do you do that? Well, first of all, you've got to establish what should be at the top of the list and what comes after. And for most people, I will say to them, if your work, if your business is at the top of the list and your family and personal life comes second, good luck. Because that's going to be a tough life to sustain, and you're going to miss a lot. I think we all know that we have to have both. So if at the top of the list you put yourself, maintaining good physical fitness, making sure that you're getting enough rest, all the basic things. If you're at the top of the list, then your relationship, whatever that is, in my case, it's a marriage of almost 25 years now. Is that the next most important thing? Yeah. Then my kids, because if I have a good marriage, I can take care of my kids, and my wife and I will do a much better job if we then be good parents for work. And the opposite is usually the case. Usually the person's individual health and wellness is at the bottom of the list, and the work is at the top. And I can tell you from having, the natural process of aging, that's just not sustainable. And the best leaders, the most effective leaders I work with, maintain a balance by constantly prioritizing, looking at their calendars, looking at their time, and managing it as a strategic asset. In other words, it's not about an assistant saying, this is where you're going to be today. It's about you evaluating your schedule and saying, based on this schedule, how am I going to manage my priorities? Which means, how am I going to make sure I'm fit and ready to go, that I'm getting enough time with my family life, and then I take care of that, then I can take care of my work. And so I'll often look at calendars with C-level clients and say, does this reflect your priorities right now over the next 30 days? And if it doesn't, people can get kind of frustrated and think, well, how the heck can I change it? It's almost automatic that a quarter of the stuff on a calendar can come off. Almost automatic. That there's 25% that isn't absolutely necessary, but is there. And it's that kind of thought process, I think, that allows people to maintain the balance. But I can't overstress enough that the first thing you must confront is that you can't do it all. It's a fantasy that a lot of us buy into at an early age, but ultimately kind of bears itself out to be a falsehood the older you get.
Yeah, no, those are all great points. One of the things that in terms of the order of the kind of the priorities that you talked about, I forget who said this, but he mentioned if you get to live to be to old age and you ultimately get to your deathbed, it's going to be your family and friends who are going to be at your bedside, none of your coworkers, right? So, it's like if you have the opportunity to look back, it's really, that's really what's the most important thing at the end of the day once you're past your career and all that. So, touching upon something that you've also, written about, and it's this, the idea of and the importance of turning past failures into future, success. And, obviously the most effective way to kind of learn something new or pick up a new skill is to actually do it. But that requires some risk taking and doing things you've never done before. And that puts you in a situation where you might, quote unquote, fail and not, be as effective, the first time around as you had hoped. We were talking about this a few weeks back, and one of the executives said something that I hadn't really thought about before. He said, well, I manage a global team, and the issue that he has is that, this idea of failure varies by culture, and in some cultures, failure is just completely unacceptable. So a lot of the people he manages in these areas, they're risk averse. They just want to be told what to do, and they just want to do what they know they can accomplish, because from the time they were very little, and just the cultural norms, you don't want to fail. So it's hard enough for even us, here to kind of accept failure and try to learn from it. How do you go about doing that? And I guess secondly, how do you if you are managing a global team, how do you kind of instill that across a global team?
Great question. I go back. We constantly talk about fundamentals, and it's a fundamental truth that you cannot succeed without failing. It's also a fundamental truth that you cannot succeed without failing a lot. It bears itself out. We can read about it. We can hear about the story of the individual that had to go through lots of tough times before they actually made it. But when it comes to our personal view on that, we seem to want to change the rules around. We don't want to have to go through that failure. That can be somebody else. That doesn't have to be us. So the first fundamental is, again, a mindset. Just like I had said before about this issue that we all have limitations. I think it's really critical in this case that you develop the right mindset that says, hey, failure, if I'm not failing, I'm probably not doing something right. I'm not reaching far enough outside my capabilities. I'm not taking enough risk. Cultural issues exist. And I don't have a magic formula for how one deals with the differing cultural biases towards failure. However, the human condition is the same. And it still bears out that we have to look at failure as one of life's great lessons. And I go back to when my daughter was 5 years old, and she's a very type A alpha girl, and she was at a piano recital. She was up at the stage, and all these people were gathered around, and the door was closed, and she hit a couple of wrong notes, and she exploded and got so upset that she ran out of the room and down the hall, and I went and chased her, and I talked to her, and I remember that moment very starkly, in that I said, this has got to happen. You will not have perfect performance. You will not. I don't know about you, Adrian, but I don't know anybody who has perfect performance. However, sitting up at that piano in front of all those people is a gutsy thing to do, whether you're 5 years old or whether you're 25 years old. And I think we need to instill in our culture that failure is a learning tool. Now, if you don't learn from failure, then you are in trouble, because failure has become a way of life. And I think what failure has to be is it has to be a learning moment, and you have to extract from failure what you can learn from it, what will change in your behavior or your actions as a result of the consequences of whatever happened to you. And I think that's that's what we look for in business executives too. It's not that they don't fail. Frankly, it's how do they view failure, and how do they handle it, and how do they leverage it to scale it across their organization.
Yeah, great points as you were talking, and kind of talking about your daughter. I manage Little League, and I coach my son's team, and as a manager and a coach, I kind of we talk about the same kind of things, right? You're gonna strike out, right? You're gonna end up walking. If you're pitching, you're gonna walk, 10 batters, or you're gonna hit some batters along the way. You're gonna miss that fly ball or easy, ground ball. But it's how, what can you learn from it, to make the play the next time, right? And I think, ultimately that kind of builds itself up into, the work experience as well as really what you do from those failures, what you learn from it and take away from it to help you, move forward and improve upon for next time. My daughter also plays the piano, so she hasn't run out on her recitals yet, but but now I know. Now if she does down the road, I at least have something prepared for to console her a little bit. Kind of shifting gears a little bit again. I wrote a blog posting last November called "A Troubling Issue in Supply Chain Talent Development," where I talked about what I've experienced. A lack of verbal and written communication skills by a lot of professionals, and I've had the opportunity to teach at the executive MBA level and read reports that they hand in, and it's really depressing to see folks in their 30s, 40s. I guess to put it bluntly, not being able to write very well, very effectively, or stand up in front of a group and really communicate in a clear, concise way, ideas, thoughts, make a persuasive argument, etc. And the Wall Street Journal just came out with an article a few weeks back, kind of touching upon the same thing. So my argument is that there's only so far you can climb up the leadership ladder without having effective verbal and written communication skills. Do you agree? Do you see that as an issue? And what can an executive do to kind of fine tune or improve those skills?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think about communication pretty holistically, given what I do for a living. So that includes writing, that includes speaking, that includes face gestures, that includes all kinds of things, right? And the reality is that the higher you go in an organization, the more your effectiveness is achieved through others. And I think one of the key skills that leaders have, whether they're a senior VP of supply chain or, frankly, a director of supply chain or somebody who's running a crew in a manufacturing plant, it's the ability to communicate your ideas and your thoughts. And one proxy for how well you can do that is writing. But I've rarely seen somebody with really poor writing skills who happen to speak really well, too. They tend to go together. So you have to look at communication as a general issue and recognize that nobody's going to understand you just because you want them to or just because you think they should. People are going to understand you because you have made it relevant and easy for them to understand you. And that plays itself out through writing. I do think email has been a bane and a benefit. You can write poorly in an email and be okay. Nobody has to open up a letter anymore, or at least very few. But the problem is that if you don't know how to structure a sentence properly, if you don't know how to structure paragraphs and thoughts properly, you probably aren't communicating properly verbally either. And so I do believe that communication effectiveness becomes critical. Anybody who's looking to be successful in their career. And it's a little bit of the smartest kid in the class syndrome. You can be extremely bright and be able to crunch numbers every which way and maybe be the first to come up with an answer to a problem. That doesn't mean you can lead. If you want to lead, you have to have intellect, but you have to leverage your intellect through communication skills and other leadership skills. Because the reality is, if you can't communicate, then you really can't work with other people effectively. And that's becoming, as you know, cross-functional teams are becoming the norm across matrix organizations. The ability to enlist the hearts and minds of people through all kinds of communication is all part of how people get directed and led. And I think people need to remember that if you're relying on your listener to figure it out, because they should be able to figure it out, then you're already 4 or 5 steps behind this issue. You have to put yourself in their position and say, okay, if I got this letter, if I got this communication, how would I feel? Would I understand the points I'm trying to make? Would I be able to take action on it? Would I be inspired? Or might I be pretty depressed or pretty disappointed? When I get something that's poorly written, I know that my first reaction is the person must not care that much. I mean, that's
great.
That's the way we're wired.
Right. And I think it creates, to that last point, it creates perhaps some negative impressions right off the bat that might be inaccurate, just because of, that first impression you create with how you communicate. You talk about, another thing you talk about that I like is the importance of building your leadership brand. What exactly do you mean by building your leadership brand, and how does a young professional or someone manager, director level exactly go about doing that, building that brand?
Well, the first thing I would say is that the leadership brand is no different than any other brand. So think about a commercial brand that you have a lot of respect for. Toyota, great car company, right? Everybody, up until recently anyway, most people would hear Toyota and they'd have associations. They might associate to quality. They might associate to reliability. They might associate to innovation. But certainly quality would be a major common association that Toyota would, their brand would engender in people. We are no different as human beings. People have those same associations about us. So when they hear your name, Adrian, they're thinking, they've got a vision, they've got a picture in their mind, they've got feelings that are being generated. And my point in leadership branding is we need to take, first of all, accept the fundamental truth that we all have a brand now. It may not be the one we want, but it's the one we have. And since it is a fundamental truth that we're going to have one, it seems to me that it would be valuable for us to put some thought into what we really want it to be. And so when I talk about leadership branding, I talk about transcending the stereotypes, transcending a lot of the misperceptions people may have about you, and taking control and management over your brand within your company and external to your company. So that's kind of the high-level truth, I think, and from my point of view anyway, on brands. The question then becomes, well, how do I build a brand? And I talk about this in depth in some of the articles that I write. But the first thing I would start with is to say, when people hear, if you're a supply chain professional, when people hear supply chain, what do you think some of the common brand identification is? You can call them stereotypes on the negative side, or you can call them positive, because they're both, right? You have associations about some of the ones that I hear frequently. It's very analytical, very execution-oriented, very driven people, very organized people, technically competent, as you said earlier, engineers. Those are things that come with being a supply chain person, right? The question is, do those all apply to you, or do those apply along with a few other things? And so what we have to figure out is, okay, how do other people see us today? So we do audits with clients. I will go out and actually do, quote, market research on behalf of a client to find out what perceptions exist about that individual. And that's usually pretty insightful and helpful to the executive, sometimes surprising. I would say, too, that you've done it right when, you can imagine that 50 conversations are occurring simultaneously about you all over, the U.S. or the world for that matter. And the same questions being asked in each interaction, which is, tell me what Adrian's like. How would you describe Adrian? And if those answers are relatively consistent and are what you want them to be, then you've got a pretty powerful brand. So you've got to reach out. You've got to find out what other people think. And then you have to figure out what repositioning you want to do. Because there may be perceptions today that people don't want. For instance, some of my clients say they view me as a supply chain person only. I want to do more. I want to branch out into other functions, or I want to become a business unit president or whatever. So you have to then begin to think through, well, what in my experience in my life will speak to and inform new associations on the part of other people. Experiences I've had that they may not even know about, for instance. How do those experiences, how would they show up in a brand, and the feelings they generate in people? So it's critically important, and I think everybody comes to this discussion with a different set of associations. But I think sometimes it's kind of soft and fuzzy work unless you really start to get it down to the commercial analogy, and then it makes a lot of sense.
Right. Do you see? I was talking to one of our members a few weeks back, and we were talking about the role of social media in supply chain, and he's very much involved in LinkedIn and very much involved with Twitter. And one of the things he said was, he started getting engaged in social media. Number one, as a way to learn, right? Keep a pulse on what's happening there, and he viewed that vehicle as an effective means to do that. But he actually said, I want to kind of build out my brand. Right? He wants to he's creating his own content. He's got a blog, and he wants to be out there, be seen as a thought leader. In replying to groups or tweeting information, things like that. Do you see a role here in terms of social media, in terms of helping someone develop their own personal brand within the industry, within as part of their professional development? That you see more of that, or what the potential is there? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I do, but again, I think that sometimes the social media stipulation it seems almost like everybody should be involved in social media. Everybody needs to be LinkedIn and Twitter and everything else. But I think at the end of the day, when we step back from it, we see all these things, whether it's LinkedIn or Twitter or any of the others, as a channel. It's simply a channel to communicate and to market. And whether you're marketing your brand, whether you're marketing, your resume, it's all channel marketing, and it's getting out the message. And there's a lot of ways to do it. And those are solid ways. They're certainly growing. They're not going away. They're only going to increase. But the one thing I will say is that at the professional level, it still boils down to personal experiences with you. So you can get so much out of a blog and so much out of a Twitter, but I think some people might go a little too far in thinking that's a comfort zone. It's easier to do that perhaps than it is to be uncomfortable at a networking gathering or a cocktail party where you actually have to, converse with people and that you don't know and broach that uncomfortableness. And so I think I still think that human networking is king at marketing your brand. All these other things are supportive of that. It's hard to imagine that you would hire somebody off the internet without talking to them.
Right. Well, great point. I think it ties back. That point just ties back to what we just talked about in terms of effective communication skills, and it links into we have time for one more question, so I'll go ahead and ask it now because I think it kind of relates to that a little bit. You tend to work more with C-level folks versus kind of lower level folks, but I'm sure you've got a perspective, or you come across a lot of high potential or kind of next generation of leaders. From your perspective, what concerns you the most about kind of the next generation of potential leaders out there, and what inspires you the most about them? And then what can the next generation learn from today's leaders and vice versa?
Well, I think in terms of the first question, what concerns me, I think that every generation, I've got a father who's 90 years old, so he would probably talk about his generation, the Depression generation. Now we have the millennials. We've got all these different generations. There are things that we all share in common, and there are things that are different. We all want to have a good life. We all want to be successful, however we define success. But what motivates us and what we experience, what I guess energizes us has changed significantly. What energizes the millennial generation today, I talked to somebody this morning on another call, and he said, I don't know how to get these quote millennials, these new folks, really motivated and working hard. They don't seem to want to work that hard. Now that's an assumption, that's a perception that may or may not be true. I can't really say I know that. I know that that everybody's experience is different. My father was forged in the Depression and the Second World War. If you look at where kids are today, the millennials, new people coming out, they've been forged in a world of low economic growth, of unemployment, of very challenging corporate environment where corporations have laid off tons of people. That sounds like the Depression, but it's kind of different because it's structurally changed. I mean, the Depression recovered. I don't know if we're ever going to change and go back to the orientation corporations had in our lives, let's say, when I was a kid. So I think that my biggest issue around any leaders, the young leaders today, is to find out what inspires them. And that's a mutual responsibility. Part of that is their responsibility, but part of that is our responsibility. And to not project what inspires us onto them, that they should be, for instance, satisfied with a job that we may have not liked. Okay? You have to ask, well, why aren't they satisfied? Not maybe because they don't like the work, but it may not be stimulating enough, or they may not understand where it leads, or any number of other issues. I mean, I think you have to, as leaders, we have to connect to the hearts and minds of our young leaders today and figure out if they feel disenfranchised, why, and give them a purpose, give them a sense of inspiration of making a contribution. And I think right now there's kind of a darkness out there on the part of some, especially younger kids that are joining. I call them kids of my age, but when they join companies, they don't have the same optimism, because that formula that you work real hard, you bust it, then you get promoted, then you buy a house, and you have kids, and that's really changed. And so we've got to figure out how to make what we do relevant to their lives, their experience.
Great, all great points and advice and great food for thought. With that, we're kind of out of time, but I just want to remind all our members that we can keep the conversation going. I'm going to invite Tim to be a guest member as part of the discussion forum related to this MindPick session, so that if you've got any additional questions, food for thought, things you want to talk to Tim about, we'll forward them along to Tim, and Tim will have the opportunity to participate in those discussions as well. So again, Tim, again, thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us today. This was a fascinating conversation. I think we scratched the surface on a number of different angles here, but I think you gave us a lot of great food for thought, a lot of things to think about, and I'm sure that in the days ahead, we'll probably come back with some questions related to some of these things. So again, thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Adrian. I've really enjoyed the conversation. Great questions. Kept me on my toes. Thank you.
Great. Well, again, thank you to everyone joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you in the next MindPick session. Thank you very much.
Sure.